Well, I don't know if I misunderstood because I think at one point Ben wanted me on his show. But since we're swap casting, I kind of hijacked it because there's so many questions I needed to ask Ben. Ben's been doing such crazy research. For those of you who are, catching up, it's been a few years of Ben just doing nonstop amazing research. His channel's at 13K. Like, if you're on my channel, make sure you are also watching the Archivist channel. You can check it out. Like, he actually posted in the chat. Let me pull this up. If you guys click on this, make sure you're subscribed, double subscribe. Make sure you're following the Ben. He's putting all kinds of crazy information on the internet, and as we've been talking for years about like fake news and the real history, he's been going through all the news more and more, deeper and deeper than ever before. How you doing, Ben? How you doing, the
Great.
archivist?
What an intro. Holy, feel like I took a substance and didn't know it.
I just try to put people in the mood. There's like some people, they just click this and then all of a sudden Isaac Hayes starts to play. Me, a little bit more AI, but it does remind me of like how narrative works, because a lot of what you're going through all this newspaper from the 1800s, 19th century, looking at what they're believing and what the context is of their. It's very anthropological what you're doing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, for those who don't know, me and you have been friends for almost 6 years.
Dude,
And even
since
longer than that now, I
since the
think.
beginning of when I've been YouTubing. Yeah, I don't know how long it's been. It's like I want to say 10, but like we'll just start saying 10. How about
Yeah. Long time.
that?
And, before I ever posted even anything really, I've had my Twitter now for like 12 years. Um, and I can't remember exactly. Yeah, I think it's kind of a similar story to you and Mike, um, and how we all just kind of met each other in this weird 1 month time frame, and Victor and everything. And
Word.
you
Happy
guys were
birthday,
in.
belated birthday to Victor. It was his birthday like a couple weeks ago.
Oh yeah, I miss Victor.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was this weird time frame. I think for everybody, you guys were in Spain, and um, I had already been watching some of your videos and was aware of Victor. And me and Victor had been talking on Minds, and then through that, I got into Discord with you and everybody. Really, some of our still good friends, and that was kind of where you know I had been following. Man, what was it called? There was an old forum, Stolen History,
All right.
and I had made some friends on there, and there was kind of this crossbreeding between Stolen History and our Discord. And anyways, long story short, it led to being more vocal about like things that I had been reading over the years, and naturally, you had a very interesting way of conveying thoughts about kind of unveiling our subconscious and how that relates to history in a way. And your videography I loved, and it was just very different. And like your first, not to say anything against your new videos, but like your first year of videos for me was my favorite, and they were just so different, and the information was unlike anything out there. And yeah, there's just a lot of overlap. And for people that haven't seen our talk about baby farms, right, and how that's
That's
become
become
quite a big
huge.
powerful subject now. That was something we were talking about, a long time ago. And yeah, segues into many, many moons later, and here we are talking about, you know, similar subject matter, but I think both of our, ideas have evolved quite a lot.
I tried to make a couple Cabbage Patch Baby clockwork pictures earlier too, just because
Mhm.
I was thinking about like, yeah, how much this has evolved and how much we've seen this concept.
No, I like that one a lot.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've covered the gamut, and just the idea of time and consciousness, and yeah, kind of the subject matter that brings us together today, talking about Eden.
Yeah.
And not just a physical Eden in space, but a subconscious Eden in the mind, and how some of my favorite authors sculpted the way I look at not only reality today, but kind of biblical, Genesis, so to say, right? Adam and Eve type stuff. and how these stories can be more than just a physical representation. That so many, um, hardcore fundamentalist Christian and religious types cling to these stories, but that there is an inkling of not only truth, but there's more to it. That the Jesus always spoke in parables, right? And he always, I would say, overemphasized the importance of the parable and speaking, and not necessarily, um, I don't want to say rhyme because that's not what I'm trying to say, but you get what I'm saying,
Yeah,
right?
make it symmetrical to reality without using this current, so that this current thing never gets displaced.
Yeah, and it's like immune to time and to society, right? And it really is like the subconscious idea of speech and language and humans and our existence. When you read like scripture on a very like suggestive symbolical level, it it holds very it holds really strong for me. I mean, obviously everybody feels differently about scripture, but I think me and you have connected quite a lot on that subject. And for those who don't know, I'm my wife is Mormon, and my mom was a Baptist, and my father was Christian, and but I was never forced into any particular belief. I was completely led astray, and that was quite lonesome, so to say, from a religious standpoint or a spiritual standpoint as a child. But I'm grateful now as an adult. It led me to finding my own way, so to say. And yeah, rambling. But yeah.
No, but like it's interesting because so many people would think. I mean, like I mean, a lot of the time you think religion leads to some of these ideas, but it's weird. A lot of it is that religion used to lead to like math, science, and truth searching, right?
Hmm.
And so there were people that discovered these truths, but so much of organized societal religion today is suppressing the weirdest possible things. So you're not likely to hear about Eden as much today in church. You're talking more about how you can live your life in the world around you and be a good person and all that, which is great. But I don't think they're talking so much about some of this history and archaeology and trying to show, because it's so many people think it's all based upon like having suspension of disbelief, which is not really at all what it has to do with. Like you can look deeper and deeper into the context, see what people believed and what it's about. And we have more and more data to look at, are they talking about something that's true? Because just because someone's talking about something in a newspaper doesn't mean that it happened.
Hmm.
Obviously, we've had that
Obviously.
happen a lot. But we've also had a lot of circumstances where the more they try to hide what's happened, you can start to see the outline of what's going on, right? So, I mean, yeah, without being told what to think, you're just seeing this outline eventually. You're like, hey, this is a pretty weird outline. And it's even more interesting that no one's pre-suggested to you. Like, I don't know any religion that's talked about baby machines. Like I don't know that, not it's
Yeah.
not like a huge part of any religion I know about. So yeah, it's something that kind of has emerged, but as you look at it, you're like, this all ties in very well into all. This is the simplest solution to a lot of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not afraid to get weird, and I know you're not either. But the more I, read papers, again, why I was mentioning so much that the lens that it holds up to time, right? Whatever you feel about scripture, or, the Torah or the Quran or the Bible, or, you know, Buddha's teachings, whatever it is, the fundamental part of it, like from a symbolic standpoint, is almost universal. Um, the details is where people get lost. Everybody gets lost in the details and the translations, and which is natural, right? The confusions of tongue. You just think of the Babel story when you look at people arguing over the details, and not, it's never about all the similarities that we share. Doesn't matter what your religion is. You're going to have so many more similarities than you are differences. But it's always about the differences, right? Those are always what push society apart, and people and whatever. But yeah, my upbringing was, um quite the opposite. Instead of it being a pushing and pulling effort, it was like a stagnant, um, you know, still water. But yeah, anyways, I had a near death experience I've talked about a lot. And, for a person who's never touched psychedelics, and I have nothing against them at all. I had a strong enough experience that I'm satisfied that there's nothing in the psychedelic world for me. Now, I'm sure people will disagree with that, and that's okay. But I had enough of an experience that I realized, the adjoining world concept. And yeah, it kickstarted the obsessive reading. And but yeah, without getting too far off subject, that was kind of a background flashback for not only our history, but a bit of my own from a kind of religious standpoint.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because Eden has both religious connotations and also archaeological connotations. This idea, does humanity come from a single place? It kind of makes sense, right? That
Yeah,
something would spread out from a single place. I mean,
100%.
so it becomes more pragmatic than just spiritual. And then, but then at a certain point, we have to think about how memory works, how DNA works, how interesting it is that this exists. So there is something kind of, we talk about the zeitgeist, like the spirit of the times. So there is kind of a spirit to humanity, and this idea that this thing has been going on, even if some people die, even if everyone dies, the whole thing is still immortal in a sense. Like this is the
Yeah,
same human superorganism that's been going on, unless it's been
the
stopped.
mushroom, you know, symbolism is so powerful for me when you look at it from that standpoint you just said there, right?
Right.
That our ideas of what is living and what is dead are just really quite wrong. And I hate to say, I'm not like grouping everybody together because I'm sure a lot of people feel
Right.
quite differently about the subject, but you get what I'm saying, the
Yeah.
zeitgeist. Um,
Thank you,
Whereas,
Stefan.
it was kind of the opposite of what it is nowadays, especially from a religious standpoint. Now, obviously, there are different representations of this. Buddhism is one that stands out to me the most. There are ideas of death and what death was. I think are the most relevant to me now, especially after my experience that I had. I have absolutely no fear of it, whereas it was just such a kind of unknown that without that experience, I think I may have still um, kind of had that repressed idea or fear of opening that door, which is all death is to me. It's just opening another door. And but yeah, religion seems to be kind of an idea of paying penance and you know uh, giving the man your money on the boat across the river
Hmm.
and weighing your heart against the feather. And although there are some relevance to all of those stories, I think that really just comes down to what you're doing. The idea of inner work, and I think to everybody that's different.
I hate to do this, but Travis McClung did the Box Saga thing. Where we have this rule now that if someone says Box Saga, we have to play Box Saga for a second here.
Witnessed
about-
it the other day on your stream.
Do you know what box? Do you know what box? Yeah, it's like a rule now. Do you know what Box Saga is?
Well, I mean, I know of the Box Saga itself, actual saga. I don't
Yeah.
know of this band or song.
No. This is an AI generated song just made about that book that you know about for the purpose of that. I feel like Box Saga actually ties into what you're saying in a sense. Actually, this idea that religion.
Oh, this is AI generated. That's great. I had
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the Box Saga. And one of our mutual friends, Longo.
Yeah.
It's something that I don't talk about a lot, but with him, especially since I met him, it's definitely been on the forefront of my mind. And yeah, you've seen some of my Etruscan stuff, and we
Mhm.
mentioned off air kind of the Aztec, the similarities between these creation myths that exist not only in the Yucatan but in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing we could bring up. The Aztecs. This is from a newspaper article from 1819. What is this from? 1890s or 19
I
something?
think it says it if you go back. It'll say it in my clip.
1919, so during like the flu year. Okay, so Aztecs were crossbreeds of Indians and Etruscans, declares Professor Porta, right? And so I feel like there's probably a better demonym to say maybe than crossbreed, but that is what, in history they decided to say. And it
Yep.
is what they're trying to say is more to the point of Etruscans, and when they're saying Indians, I think what they're, at that time, Indo-Asian, it includes a lot of people in the
A
Indo-Asians.
lot of people. I mean, they even said Aryan.
Scythians, right?
Yeah.
Scythians and Aryans, right?
Mhm.
So that's really fascinating because if you start to look at some of the haplotypes, I mean, today that's kind of what we're finding as Scythian haplotypes in North America. So, but this is from 1919, and so he's saying Etruscan. And Etruscan is interesting because when we think of Etruscan, we're thinking of the indigenous people of where Italy and Rome is today, but also
Yep.
Slavic people all around Macedonia and that entire region, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Turia was, it was quite. It's really been hidden as much as the idea of what a Mayan was, right? An Etruscan versus what a Mayan. These racial, so to say, labels have changed dramatically, and they, like you mentioned, Scythian, Slavic. It covered the gamut, and it kind of harkens to the Atlantean idea, and that we were dealing with a culture that didn't identify themselves at all by skin color. In fact, when you look in old writings about what an Aryan was, it had nothing. You could find it was like the Egyptian explanation of
A
what an
lot of these
Egyptian was.
titles are about so an Arab or a rabbi or something has to be literate, right? A
Hmm.
Phoenician, someone who can write in the
Right.
phonemes. So
Yeah.
yeah, culturally, you're culturally part of the culture.
Yeah. And since you mentioned the Box Saga, um, Etruscan lore myth is identical with Finnish lore, and you find Wotan and Jodin and Odin and Wotan and all of these things
Right.
on just about every continent. And
Which
yeah,
seem to also be connected to the Indo-Aryan, like Shiva,
hmm,
and
yep,
Odin, and it's
yeah. The
pretty interesting.
Scythian connection is really important. They're much like the idea of a Tartar. Um, what a Tartarian or a Tartar was has lost a lot of its meaning, or at least been misrepresented. And I think that you can say that about just about anyone pre mid 1800s. That's like the sweet spot for me. And the newspapers strongly support that. Um, yeah, there's something happened in our cultural timeline or historical timeline, and everything like resets, so to
Right.
say, at least from the American narrative,
Well, it seems
what
like
America was.
even from the Turkish narrative, right? Like, and that was kind of interesting too. You brought up showing this map in the 1880s. Jerusalem was in Turkey, the holy city, and the holy city to the Greeks and the Russians. The following posts from a pre-location change are even more interesting, right? And kind of showing.
Well, and we've talked about this in the past, but one of your guests, who's one of my favorite parts of your
Ooh,
series.
why is it happening? Keep talking while I figure out how to turn this off. I don't know what's going on, but my screen is like making noises. Just you talk for a while I fix this.
Yeah, uh, yeah, I got disconnected. That was strange. Um, oh, let's hope this is still working for me here. Hold on one second. Okay, okay. Um, where were we? Yeah, we were talking about Turkey and Constantinople, symbolism of Constantinople and that map you showed. It was called the center. It was called Eden. It was called Jerusalem. Um, yeah, many things, and just this idea that the Eden, as we know it, at least from a physical standpoint, has shifted places, or at least been identified by many different places around the realm. And what I love so much about that picture you showed was it reminded me when I was listening to one of your episodes, um, and your guest was talking about the history of Constantinople and that perhaps that was the original place of Christ's crucifixion. It reminded me of some of my early um, newspaper dives into Constantinople and what they were finding because Constantinople came online in a similar way to America, early 1800s. You find a lot of pictures of Turkey where it's desolate and they're just kind of cleaning the dirt out of the streets. And like I do when something pops into my mind and I'm thinking like, okay, what was this really like in this time frame? I just resort to the newspapers like I've done with a million different subjects, and it was crazy. Even still until the 1840s, 1850s, 60s, 70s, they were calling Constantinople Jerusalem,
Hmm.
and it's it just like it blew me away. And although there, I've seen Jerusalem on several maps in different
Right.
places. From you've actually been there, right? What's the city I'm thinking of in Peru? Um,
Berlin. Are you talking about Berlin or in Iquitos or
no, the main one, the main city there.
oh Lima,
Is it Lima?
Lima,
I can't.
Peru?
Again, I feel like I'm going to get it wrong, but Peru. There was old maps of Peru that had it labeled as Jerusalem.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of Jews that came to Peru also, and so when you go to like the middle of the rubber Amazon, you'll see old Jewish pharmacies and all of these things from the 1800s that look like you're in. The building quality looks like you're in like Indiana, like it's out of concrete though, but it has like French kind of windows and everything. But you're in a swamp, or like in certain parts of the rainforest are really muggy and humid and everything. So it sticks out as kind of bizarre juxtaposition.
Cusco.
Oh, Cusco. Okay,
Yeah,
Cusco
you can
as
definitely you should be able to Google that and you find some old pictures. Me and Victor went over them. Well, one of our shows, I'm pretty sure. But yeah, you can find all kinds of lost tribe um, descriptions of
hmm,
Cusco.
and like the same mapping style. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
like it does have the same mapping structure style, like the way it looks. It's kind of interesting.
so you think it'd be easier to find because it's something I've been able to. Anyways, this region, you know, um, the lore there exists, and maybe some people haven't seen that map I'm thinking of, but I probably have it on Twitter somewhere, and I'll look for it here in a second. But yeah. So, anyways, I'm spacing the guest's name. You know who I'm talking about, the gentleman you've had on several times. That was the one speaking about the crucifixion of Christ, and many of the old paintings actually shows that famous church in Constantinople in the background.
Right, David Ewing Jr. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so much of his work, and I'm sure you feel the same way, overlap. Like I remember me and you specifically, our conversations that you had with him were like one-offs of each other. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Here's like
So
the
there's the map.
Cusco, Jerusalem. Right.
Yeah, so there's
And
the
it
map
makes a
on
lot
it.
of sense actually when you say that because, I mean, the way it's laid out as a grid, it does seem kind of like that same sort of Jerusalem idea, or like a God's human city, a city run by the gods for humans. And it's all these epicenters of genetic modification. Like we have all these records of things like corn or cotton or strange things that emerge out of places like this. We're like, wow, how did corn happen? Like it seems like clearly genetically modified, but we're supposed to believe these are, you know, simple folk that weren't able to genetically modify corn. Yet here it is.
Yeah, yeah, and that goes that's like completely could jump us into a million different correlations there. Like
Yeah.
talking about mummy corn. You find corn entombed in tombs all around the world, everywhere. China, Russia, all across the Americas, the Yucatan, Egypt. Corn, mummy corn, quote unquote, mummy corn. That's what they were captioning it or calling it in the 1800s. Some of it was in such a great state of preservation that they planted it, and
Wow.
it grew. Here's the craziest thing about it is that not only did it grow over 15 feet tall, the corn itself, the ears, they didn't start until like 9 feet up. So like a normal human wasn't even able to harvest this corn without a ladder.
Wow.
And they found it to be incredibly crop resistant or drought resistant. Sorry, the leaves were a dark green, unlike anything they'd ever seen. And they find this same thing with mummy wheat and all of these kind of agricultural um, staples. Right, wheat was primarily supposed to be kind of a European thing, and they're finding ancient wheat here in tombs in America. Same thing goes for corn. And all these other things, right? Mummy cocaine, all these different substances that in these time frames were coming from very particular parts of the world, but were
Brutal.
found all over. And just again, reigniting the idea of we're dealing with a global civilization, right? That you covered so many times, the Tartaria thing, that we're dealing with a culture that was like Etruria, and like many of the cultures of the Yucatan, this Atlantean idea. These cultures were well aware of everybody. There was no part of the realm that hadn't been explored, right? And if you can take this to even farther down a rabbit hole and talk about, the poles, the South Pole or the ice wall, whatever your opinion of Earth shape is, and the northern latitudes, right, beyond 80, below 80, and that what happened before this kind of idea of seasons and poles and ice, right? And that just about every ancient culture and all the old maps, mid 1500s, show a northern latitude that is free from ice as well as a southern latitude that's free from ice. And when we talk about, advanced cultures and so on and so forth, people often try to think, the Atlantis thing has kind of whitewashed it a bit as far as like technology. People think, we're dealing with these dirigibles and flying ships, although that may be true. I think to an extent it
We're
was
looking
more
at
of a
18th century renaissance of that awareness. Yeah.
it was more like an Avatar type thing for me.
Yeah.
It was like more advanced, um,
Techno-Gaia-ness.
natural,
Yeah.
advanced. Right. We had huge animals. Right. Man and beast walked together, and it wasn't always this horrible, terrible relationship. I think there was some symbiosis between man and
And
animal.
when you say the Arturians, are you talking about like the Semitic Urati, like the Urati too? Is this what you mean, or who are the Arturians?
Well, the Uratu, yeah. This is where you get the bridges, as you were already stating, between Indo-Scythian, Indo-Aryan, right? The bridge there, the Black and the Caspian bridge between what's a Scythian and what's an Etruscan, and you've covered a lot of these, and how they just start coming up with words to describe all these different cultures, but really
Right.
fundamentally they're almost all going back to what we started our conversation with, that like the mushroom idea, and that we all kind of come from one
Yeah. Imagine trying to explain
seed.
French Canadians in 1,000 years. It's gonna be like, what? We
Yeah.
got a comment from Jose Rodriguez, which says Coromeo, is that how I say it? Was
Cody
just
Mayo, yeah.
Curimeo was just talking about this earth and showing the picture of the city in Cusco being the citadel of David with the three walls, etc. So that's good. 100th monkey. People are becoming aware. I like that a lot because when you go to South America, you start to see just like megalithic structures and neoclassical architecture, and it just doesn't really fit. You're like, why would they put so much effort into this place? It's more effort than you'd think possible. Like it actually looks nicer than in a lot of places in Europe. It's just incredible, really, and it's a lot older looking in a lot of situations, and just the most far out flung crazy places, like in Colombia, the cathedral in the middle of the mountains and everything, like
Oh my
monasteries.
gosh, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm very familiar with that one.
yeah,
Yeah, it makes absolutely no sense. And that's kind of everything in this realm. I'm going to take a quick little break. My baby's awake. I'm going to take him downstairs. I'll be right back.
Okay, for sure. While he's jumping out for a second, let me like go over some of the things I saw on his channel that were pretty cool. So, looking at like the archivist channel, he did some things talking about New Eden, right? So, if I go to his YouTube channel actually and go to archivist, you can go to the top. Should be subscribe. What? I must have double clicked it or something. See, they just unsubscribe me, guys. If you ever think, oh yeah, I'm subscribed to somebody, make sure you go back and click it again, or like if you or don't click it again, but make sure you're clicked, like, cause, or maybe that's what happens. Is that what happens when people unclick? God only knows. Is this the one? Anomalies in America. Anomalous in America. I'm gonna go to live. It was near the top. Eden in America. Yeah. So in his Eden in America video, he talked a bit about all this Phoenician art, right? And so when you start looking into like the Phoenician understanding of art, like this is already happening 100 years ago, where they're saying, "Hey, we were finding examples of this in South America as well." But also, there's a bunch of stuff that they find in North America that gets kind of suppressed and purchased up by religious organizations and social utopian philanthropists who want to put them in museums. And almost everything is said to become, is a forgery. Like they're always like, oh, well, turned out that there was nothing here. But it's always in a part of the United States where someone wants to own a huge amount of land that they want to tear out everything and they want to have just grazing of cattle or something like that. So it becomes pretty interesting because we're like, well, all these places in the Midwest, let me see if I can find that map, where they have like major grazing of cattle and everything. This is all in this area here that was at one point like sea and flooded. So, this area all gets completely covered over. We're not able to look at it. Then we start to look at the history of the mining operations, right? So you know about what happened in California with the gold rush, but then in Nevada you have all the silver mining that goes on, and so silver mining, they're blowing up entire mountains and they're going into the mountains themselves. So silver mining is a little bit more intense. Instead of just like trying to shatter a mountain and pour the gold powder out as it floods out. Oh, I think Ben's back. I was just
Sorry
talking
about that.
That was cool. I was just talking about silver mining and how you look at the Midwest and how places where they had a bunch of the Egyptian style ruins, like you were finding in some of this video here. You show kind of the stuff here. Like we found stuff like that, but they're in areas of the United States that's been flooded out. But maybe you want to go into a bit about like discoveries in Indiana and Midwest and America.
Yeah. Again, I guess kind of the idea of this episode is to steal a line from Hermes, right? As above, so below.
Mm-hmm.
As within, so without. That we inhabit a world that is like a macro, micro representation of ourselves. And the idea that we come from a time where consciousness perhaps was quite different than we think of it today. And that one of my favorite authors, Julian Jaynes, describes Eden as a time before mankind had that inner dialogue, that kind of analog, again, where I get my name, or at least, my nickname, so to say, the analog eye, that ability to have self-awareness and to speak internally, so to say. And that, I've talked about this book a lot, and if you're not familiar with it, listeners out there, I can't recommend a book more than this book. It'll change the way you think about everything. But basically, he describes Eden, right? You have male and female.
Sorry, this is Julian Joyce, or who is this?
Julian Jaynes.
Julian Jaynes, and which book is it?
The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's my number one book of all time. Really helped me come to terms with kind of a deeper understanding of not only dream state, but this realm we inhabit, meaning, purpose, all history. But his explanation of Eden is that Eden was an age of innocence. It was a time of innocence, right? That's kind of that exists in religious explanation. But what he means by an age of innocence was that you didn't have dialogue, you didn't have an interior self. There was no awareness, right? What separates man from beast is often the main descriptor is that they're unaware of themselves, at least from an idea of consciousness, that they're almost like a program. And I know me and you have covered the gamut in many years past, talking about uh, the AI programming, right? I think it's GAN and WAN. I may be pronouncing those wrong. If there's a program in here or somebody that knows, maybe you do. The two types of coding, right? There's GAN and WAN. I can't remember how to say them exactly. Um, one is more adversarial, me versus X, and the other one is more like everything needs to coalesce and come together to improve the system. Um, and
Do
I
you
think
mean like
that's
a
a good.
global area network versus a wide wireless?
No, it's a type of coding,
Hmm.
and I'm probably saying the wrong thing. Um, but there's two types of it, and one is a like I was saying, one's like a um, think of it like one's a me versus simulation, and the other one's a it's like one's Farmville and one's like a first person shooter. I know that's a horrible um, adjective to use to describe it, but
Well,
anyways,
what is the first person shooter and what is Farmville in that analogy?
well, like one is about a society that is 100% coalescing for the greater good of the society. And the other one would be a more representation of the kind of society we have today, for the most part,
Hmm.
where you're constantly obsessing about your tiny little bubble, the little world you live in, and how you can make the world, the tiny little bubble
So
world you live in.
one is like chiseling and like gardening, and the other one is like growing, or one is sculpting and one is growing, right? Like one is you're removing things, like in a first person shooter, you're removing elements from the equation, and in a Farmville, you're creating and allowing things to grow, manifest,
Sure.
following laws of physics.
Yeah, it was probably a poor analogy on my part. But yes, one is about your place in the world and how you contribute to it. And the other one is more about the things you can do to collect more things, to draw more things into yourself, into
Mm-hmm.
individual versus collective. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay.
So, Julian's idea of Eden, and whenever I talk about these places again, whether or not Eden is described as a physical place, people have heard me talk about it with Dr. Longo that Eden was in Florida. I've done plenty of presentations where people have talked about Eden was in the Yucatan or in the Gulf of Mexico somewhere. And although I love all those stories, fundamentally those stories come from an internal space for me. And what Julian did is explain that in a way. Um, I'm going to quote something.
Sure.
Um, this is a book. Um, give me 1 second. Sorry. This is a book called Eden by Eve Wood Langford, and she kind of does a um, synopsis or quote of his work that I really love. So I'm just going to read that for everybody. Maybe it'll help explain what I'm. This book is really it's one of those things that it's kind of difficult to explain. Basically, what he says is that all of the kings were made kings by the gods, and all of the people that were made subjects were subjects of the king, who was the voice, the physical voice of God, and that all of these kings and leaders were getting internal messages, right? So their internal dialogue was not themselves, it was something exterior to them. I mean, you can look through, you know, pretty much all of the Old Testament is like this, right? The people lucky enough to hear the voice of God are then, tasked with relaying this message to the populace. And basically, what he says is that the people were incapable of saying, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. And that they were kind of like an ant colony. There was a queen, and they were all serving the queen in a way. Again, that's an analogy. And that they were all getting this internal voice of God. That before what he called the segmentation or the splitting of the hemispheres, the left and right parts of the brain, that we were all unable to even have those thoughts, and that we were, as soon as the code or the voice of God, think of it kind of like the voice of God technology that people talk about that the government has today, that when the signal was cut, people were just like wandering aimlessly, so to say. And that through, again, I'm generalizing here, but through the development of language, humans were slowly able to develop that interior dialogue, right? You've heard this before, I'm sure, that without language, consciousness as we know it wouldn't be what it is today. Now, you can manipulate the idea of consciousness just by changing the person's language. And for anybody that's studied other languages, it's very easy to see this, right? That you could say the same sentence in two languages, but they're going to have completely different ways of getting to that explanation, and that the feeling that comes from that sentence or explanation can create a completely different feeling about the subject. But anyway, so essentially that we partook of the fruit, and that was when the ability to be self-aware, right? That's when they knew they were naked. Does that make sense? That they didn't even know that they were themselves until this particular thing happened. Now, he's not saying that it was one split second and then all of a sudden all of mankind was conscious. Instead, he says that this was a kind of um, slow progression over time, and that the priests and the kings could read and write and were aware of language and all of these things, but it took thousands of years as it slowly trickled down. And although I don't necessarily prescribe to that, and neither does he, but he's quoted as saying that poets were the original gods, and that the idea that your word and your sentence and your verbiage and your vernacular was what was creating the reality around you. And I know this is a subject matter we've talked about before, but your word is your wand. This is a thing that kind of existed in Blavatsky-esque uh, subcultures and secret societies, so to say, that we're trying to remember this age where you were speaking your reality into existence. And that part of what I think was this transitory period, whatever you want to call it, in the 1800s, a reset, everybody has a different explanation for it, was part of this. Almost like we jumped into another stage of consciousness, good or bad. And that has to do with the whole idea that we've lost our connection with the past and we're, kind of physical beings with amnesia. And that's where subjects like the baby farms and all of these things where you can just kind of go crazy, talking about all these endless explanations of what possibly could have happened. And but yeah, that was a long-winded answer. I'm going to read this little excerpt here. Before Adam tasted the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of all things in the Garden of Eden, the Lord gave him the task of naming the newly created animals. And out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. This charming biblical illustration chronicles an important stage, excuse me, in human evolution, revealing that before Adam gained his mind opening form of precipitous, he was capable of speech. Pre-wise Eve demonstrated the same verbal ability by conversing with the serpent. This biblical record of the spoken word prior to the evolution of higher consciousness is compatible with more recent proposals that consciousness evolved through the use of language. The matter is explored by Julian Jaynes in The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of a Bicameral Mind. Julian Jaynes does not deem consciousness essential to the acquisition of fundamental skills or to simple reasoning, or even to a certain level of thinking. He compares it to a mental analog of the real world, much as a map is an analog of the land it represents. Though the human brain is enclosed in darkness, precipitant humans equipped with an abstract image of self, or I, can conjure onto their mental map scenarios past, present, or imagined, imaged in a possible future. Consciousness enables the human mind to see possibilities, wrestle with ideas, and grasp abstract concepts. If you see what I mean, the view of sentient is not inconsistent with the simple Gnostic proposal that when humans attained wisdom in Eden, the eyes of the mind were opened to entirely new mental vistas. In myth, history, changes to human story may legitimately take place in the blink of an eye, but in the real world, fundamental change may take a great deal longer. So thank you for letting me quote that there. But yeah, I hope that kind of gave people a bit of a better idea of what I'm trying to say. That, we take for granted these ideas of speech and rhetoric and what they actually mean to our reality.
Speaking of which, 499 from Ryzen Ability says, Andreas is everywhere by Muhammad's red beard. And hey, Ben, hope all is well, bro. Research the meme mounds. All right, well, have you researched the meme mounds? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Meme mounds, no.
All right, well, that'll be a
That's-
thing that we can look into in the future, yeah.
I've heard meme mounds, but I have no idea where they are, and I've never looked into them. So I'm gonna have to take your advice.
I have some thoughts on Egypt, on ancient Eden, and so they might be kind of opposite in some respects. Hear me out. So, because of that, hearing that humans were able to speak and that they knew the right names, I think the other thing is God's like, okay, what are these things called? Like, because God could have either asked or not asked. And so for humans to be asked, it's either a complete joke or it's because it's right. And usually I think it's because it's right. So humans knew what the right thing was. The other thing is humans were able to speak to animals. I mean, you got humans speaking to a serpent, which isn't necessarily Lucifer, and it's much later that all gets conflated as that idea, right? This cunning beast of the field. So it's really like not surprising.
Yeah, it used to be like a dove before
Yeah.
the whole serpent.
It's not surprising that these animals are talking to them. They're not surprised. So that's interesting. She's not like, oh, whoa, a talking snake. So that means that this is normal. So they're at a perfect consciousness at that point. And when they eat from the tree of knowledge, it's like there's the tree of life and there's the tree of knowledge. Maybe it's kind of Orwellian. Like the tree of knowledge took away their complete understanding of consequentialism and replaced it with good and evil, and we are building upon good and evil until we can get back to a place where we know all things so that we can get rid of good and evil, right? Because
Yeah,
good and evil are
very Buddha-esque of you.
I hope not.
Buddha
but yeah,
describes the
maybe.
transition very similar, that we go through stages like that,
Yeah.
where we like slip, we forget it all for the sake of evolution. We relearn, like you said, we go through this whole dualistic, right and wrong, right? And then we
Yeah.
get to the end of that rainbow and we realize that they're all the same thing, right?
Yeah.
And then we are on the upswing of that, where there is no confusion. We understand completely and wholly that these two ideas are really one, and that you can't have night without day, and you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And then we lose it all again,
Like a bell
and we
curve.
go through. I mean, I think the Bhagavad Gita says a very similar thing.
Yeah.
That there's a period of learning and a period of forgetting. It's just like this never-ending spiral.
I when I say I hope not, like I agree that that's probably what's happening. But like one of the things that you'd hope is that there is an escape or an escape velocity. Like there's an ascension point where you can become another thing, a newer, bigger, move on to a new challenge kind of thing. Because the idea that we're constantly just breathing in and out, it's like it's okay, but it would be nice if it had more like that, because it feels like that's the trap, right? Like to be breathing in and out, to be the breath, instead of being able to escape and to become, your own And so in a lot of ways we're trapped by ignorance, in the fact that we forget everything every generation. I mean, and it's true, like we would be really traumatized if we like lived more than a lifetime to have to remember everything. So, but why can't we handle that? And is it just, why is there so much suffering? And all that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, again, I certainly don't want to give in any kind of air of arrogance when it comes to these ideas. I truly believe that everybody has to, walk the walk, narrow is the path, right? You have to knock, you have to ask, and these parables of Jesus and all these other um, kind of prophets. Um, the journey is yours, and I can't tell you how to walk it or do it or live it or see it or anything at all, and that's certainly not what I'm trying to do. But um, I just think there's so much tied up in the symbology of what is Eden and who are Adam and Eve, and what is their symbolical journey of consuming the fruit and realizing they're naked and leaving the garden, and touching a little bit on these kind of the parables of it all. It always seems to kind of at least put me at ease in whatever hardships I'm going through in my own life. Just pausing and thinking about the Adam and Eve story has always been a good one for me. And but yeah, Julian, again, his book is incredibly. It's a difficult read. It's dense, but by the end of it, I strongly think that if it doesn't make you rethink some things, it could completely
Yeah.
rewrite the way you look at the world.
I definitely agree with a lot of the message there. So, like, I mean, first off, what's interesting is it's not saying we're starting without the ability of language. It's acknowledging that we're starting with language. So, in a way, it's a de-escalation from singularity and new sphere into the personal computer being self-aware, which is good and bad. So it's showing that. But it's interesting because a lot of people try to say we started with less and we become more. And here's the
Mm-hmm.
thing where we were all one and we become a mosaic. I like any concept that can be like primordial like that, like getting back to an Adam and Eve thing. I think like I was thinking any concept where critical testing cannot be imagined is an approximation, and metrics, have to emerge somehow from a more primitive principle set.
Yeah,
So
well said. And I think that was kind of a complex way of saying, like the idea that we come from like space amoebas or whatever is nonsense. That there is a base, and it's far more involved than we're led to believe, and
yeah,
that's why I chose that particular um, quote. Was that, yeah? It shows you that there's, even though it's zero and you're back in Eden, it's not zero as we think of it, right? We're not mindless apes banging on sticks, banging on rocks with sticks or whatever. You see what I'm saying? You see what I'm getting at?
right, yeah,
Like when
it's
you talked
total
about,
harmony. Yeah,
yeah, when you said God asked them, he didn't ask them as a joke, right? And that whether or not these things are real, again, our idea of what is real, something everybody needs to ask themselves. And then, that could send you on a 20-year journey and just in and of itself. But anyways, that no matter what, it's um, that base, that the reset point, I think, is Eden is always what I come back to, and that there is some kind of fundamental starting point. Um, and language, it always comes back to language for me. And I think that the whole idea of Babel, and kind of like you said, why is there hardship and pain and all these things? And, you couldn't have any joy without pain, and, this whole human struggle. Um, Again,
yeah. It
going back
feels
to,
like original sin has to do with like the original, like so we have the unmoved mover is like Saint Thomas Aquinas calls God. So there's something that's unmoved to start with, and it's
yeah,
moving, and that's antithetical to the rest of physics, right? So, but that's like what we've proven the Higgs boson does, which is pretty interesting. That's literally the idea, is that something that is unmoved and moves things. But then you also have this idea of uh, original sin, because things have started moving things in a negative direction. So until we stop that negative direction, then it continues to affect things. And so things continue to affect outwards, even from some original action that is causing further trauma, right?
I
So,
think that's where And Julian says it himself that the lodestone, the kind of magnetic stone worship, came from exactly what you just described, the immovable object moving everything around it, or at
Mm-hmm.
least imparting some kind of effect upon it, right? And this is kind of the whole symbolic nature of Mount Meru
Mm-hmm.
and Rupus Negra, and this central tree or pillar that's magnetic of some kind. And why people were worshiping these stones. Even in this day, the idea that Julian breaks down is that after this breakdown of the bicameral mind, and people no longer had that internal voice, that the rocks were talking,
Yeah.
that these magnetic lodestones were speaking, and that they would carry them and build a temple around them and worship them. And that was the first idol, so to say, was stones, and then they became statues. Right? They would develop some kind of, that's human nature. As we look at the sky and we see a hunter with a bow, right? Anthropomorphism. We attach things that we see in our own physical representation onto our spiritual um, kind of representations, and that these stones went from just being these lumps of stone to slowly being sculpted into statues, and then gods and idols were statues or carved little dolls, or every culture kind of had their own slow migration away from that. And I think that you touched on it there perfectly, that the unmovable that moves, you find that in every culture. And I think it goes back to this kind of idea of Eden, and that religion kickstarts in this spiraling away from those points.
And so we also have, so we got Eden, Atlantis, and Zion. Like the return to Zion is, so you got Atlantis is like a city that is kind of it's out of Eden in a sense. Like
Hmm.
because when we think of Eden, we think of this natural, we're in nature perfectly. And Atlantis is maybe like they're genetically modifying things, and we think of it as a metropolitan. But this return to Zion is interesting because the idea of Zion is to approach Eden again, right? To get to a place that's as